Thanks for listening to Lighthouse Baptist Church podcast. Lighthouse Baptist Church is an independent, fundamental Baptist church located in Pleasanton, California. This message was preached live in one of our regular church services. If you find this message a help, please feel free to subscribe. You can find out more about us at our website, lbceastbay.com. Now to the message.
Get your Bibles, please. And open to Exodus 32. Exodus 32. Need the notes for tonight? Just hold your hand up. Men are ready to help you with those. Exodus 32. How many here have ever made major blunders because you've been impatient? Most of the time it is. I'm talking about major blunders. It may be financially. It may be with people and relationships. It may be job. It may be spiritual. But we make some major blunders just because we're impatient. And many of those have lifelong consequences. I mean, we know sometimes homes are broken up and marriages are destroyed and family relationships and jobs are lost. All kinds of things just because we were impatient. So God tries to teach us through His Word about how we need to have that patience and not be impatient. Jesus put it this way in Luke 21:17, "And ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake, but there shall not a hair of your head perish. In your patience possess ye your souls." He says, man, you got to make sure you're in control of your actions and not letting impatience dictate what you do. Not letting impatience dictate your life. Not letting impatience mess you up. A lot of teenagers, a lot of adults, and many times we've made major blunders because we were impatient. So as I ask that about impatience, everybody seems to acknowledge, yes, they've made some major blunders in their life because of impatience. Did you learn anything? That's the goal. It's not to repeat it over and over again, but did you learn something? And will we heed it? So tonight, Lord willing, if He tarries His coming, we will see 4 traps, 4 snares of impatience and how the effect it can have. So there's many more we can look in the Bible. We've just got 4 tonight as we begin looking at it. So we're going to look at the first one. We'll see if we get them through all tonight. It's one of those messages where you need to know your Bible as we look at 4 different events in the Bible to get this idea about the warning and the snares of impatience so that we can say, that's me, or to put ourselves on guard that we do not fall into the same traps and same snares of impatience. Exodus 32, verse number 1. Moses, of course, at this point is on the mountain getting the commandments. And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, Up, make us gods, which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what is become of him. And Aaron said unto them, Break off the golden earrings which were in the ears of your wives, of your sons, of your daughters, and bring them unto me. And the people brake off the golden earrings that were in their ears, and brought them unto Aaron. And he received them at their hand, and fashioned it with a graving tool, after he had made it a molten calf. And they said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made proclamation and said, Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. And they rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play. Father, we ask you to help us tonight. Lord, we are susceptible to these same frailties, these same sins, these same giving into impatience. So Lord, I pray that tonight we would just simply be on guard. We would learn, we would make some decisions that we're not going to live our lives based upon impatience. We're not going to make major decisions because we feel a pressure of impatience. But God, we will learn to grow and mature and to be the kind of Christian you'd have us to be, that we might be the right kind of Christian as well as right kind of parent, right kind of employee, and just the Christian you would have us to be. Help us again, Father, please. I'm susceptible. We're all susceptible. This thing of impatience. Let us learn, and be careful to praise you for it. In Jesus' name we ask. Amen. Thank you. You may be seated. God again wants us to realize that many times we make major blunders, major errors, wrong decisions because simply of impatience. Ecclesiastes 7:8, I believe it's there in your notes. God says, better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. I think in that verse, God's just saying, boy, they got some good stuff coming if you can be patient in your spirit. The end is going to be much better than you've got now if you can be patient, if you can wait. We're talking about being patient. We're not talking about just twiddling our thumbs. We're talking about being obedient to God. So God warns us about that. It says in Proverbs 14:29, he that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty of spirit excelleth folly. So the idea is being impatient, and we're being foolish. In Romans 5:14, for whatsoever things were written aforetime, which is what we're studying today, were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. Well, there's a lot of times we don't live in hope because we're not living with patience. We're impatient. So God says these Scriptures can give us that patience and comfort. It says in Hebrews 10:36, for ye have need of patience. He says you got to have patience. You have to have patience, that after you have done the will of God, you might receive the promise. God says we need to have patience if we're going to receive the promises, if we're going to receive the fruit. In fact, when you tie that to 2 John 1:8, look to yourselves that we lose not those things which we have wrought, but that you receive a full reward. So I believe God says if we don't have patience, we might not receive the promises, or we may not receive our full reward. Again, sometimes we live our lives going through and we're doing well and we're making progress, but then because of impatience, we make some error, we make some change, and we get pushed aside and we blow it because of impatience, and we lose our full reward. So tonight we're looking at 4 instances. We'll try to get through all 4 of them. 4 snares of impatience. 4 snares, 4 things that we see devastated because of impatience. We could talk about many, but I've just chosen these 4. So first of all, from what we just read here about the golden calf in Exodus 32, we find impatience from a lack of faith brings idolatry. Impatience from a lack of faith brings idolatry. What was happening in here was they just lacked faith. They lacked faith of what was going on. And we see the story, Moses is up with getting the 10 Commandments, and the people there said, well, it's been 30 days now. We don't know what happened to this guy. We can't wait around here forever. We can't keep sitting around here. We've got to do something. We've got to have an answer. I've got to have a direction. We can't wait anymore. We must have something going on in our lives. A lot of times people just mess up their lives because they feel like something has to be going on. We got to learn just to rest a little bit. We have to learn to say, well, no news is good news. Sometimes we're just waiting. But they could not wait. They couldn't know. They said, we don't know what's happening. He said, so we make us gods. So we find that because they lacked faith in the true God, because they lacked faith in what God was going to do, because they lacked faith that God was really in control, they turned to idols. And they said, we've got to worship something. He said, make us some gods that we can worship. And that's because we will worship something. We will be worshiping something. All people will worship something. We'll have some sort of God in our lives. We have to understand it. People say, well, I don't even believe in God. They've got gods in their lives. They're worshiping something. What we need to do is have faith that we know and have complete confidence in the one true God. The one true God. Very quickly, we notice their faith, that impatience, because of lack of faith. They just didn't have enough faith to wait. They didn't have enough faith to look to God. They said, we've got to do something now. That lack of faith brought them to idolatry. Very quickly, their faith was imperfect. They had just come recently out of Egypt. God had just delivered them and brought them out and just crossed through the Red Sea. And now they're there getting the commandments from God. They told Moses, said, I'm going to go up. They said, we'll stay here. You go get the information and bring it back. But it was not very good faith. It was not very strong faith. It was not perfect faith. In other words, it wasn't mature faith. You and I, if we're going to make sure that we do not fall into idolatry, whether it be the idolatry of money, whether it be idolatry of power, of position, or anything else, we're going to have to make sure we have a mature, growing, strong faith in God. See, they say, we don't know where Moses is, we don't know what happened, and so we're panicking. And because of no faith, then they fell into idolatry. We notice their faith was imperfect. First of all, we find they had enough faith for dissatisfaction. They had enough faith for dissatisfaction. You say, preacher, what are you talking about? Remember while they were in bondage in Egypt? For 400 years they've been in bondage. 400 years they've been slaves. And finally they said, this is enough. Finally, they said, I'm not satisfied with being a slave. This is not good for us. This is not right for us. And they cried out unto God. You know, it takes some faith sometimes just to cry out unto God. It takes some faith to say, you know, I'm not where God wants me to be. I'm not where I ought to be. So they had enough faith for dissatisfaction. They were dissatisfied with their spiritual life, and they cried out unto God. They had enough faith for deliverance. So they cried out to God. God sent Moses there to them, and by faith they were able to put the blood on the doorposts, and by faith they were delivered out of Egypt. Picture of being saved. Well, I'm glad it takes faith to be saved, and God provides that faith. So they had faith for dissatisfaction, crying out to God. Let me help you. Instead of going to some shrink, cry out to God when you're dissatisfied, if you will. When the burdens of life is so great and you just can't be comfortable, learn to cry out to God. Have enough faith that God cares. Have enough faith that God will do something about it. Have enough faith that God will do what He says He wants to do in His time. So they had enough faith for dissatisfaction. They had enough faith for deliverance. They had enough faith for departure. They left Egypt. That took a lot of faith. Here's some folks that for generations have been slaves, and now they're getting ready to follow Moses out and go into the wilderness to a land God had promised, but being slaves for 400 years, they hadn't taken many vacations. They could get together and say, Dad, have you ever been to Canaan land? Yeah, we went there on family vacation about 20 years. Don't you remember that? We went there. No. They've never been out of Egypt. They've never been out. So this was going to a brand new place, a whole new world. It took faith for them to say, we're packing up and we are leaving here, going for a place we've never been. So they had enough faith for deliverance. They had enough faith for departure. The problem was they didn't have enough faith for delays. See, you and I can get to the place we think we have a lot of faith because we do this and because do that. It takes a lot of faith just to wait on God, for God's apparent delays when things are not going as fast as we want. For 30 days they had no word. For 30 days they had to wait. But because their faith was lacking, we just got to know something. We have to have some answers. We need to do something. We need to have something happening. That is impatience. Because of impatience, they end up worshiping the golden calf. Psalm 37, verse number 34, wait on the Lord and keep His way, and He shall exalt thee to inherit the land. When the wicked are cut off, thou shalt see it. So their faith was imperfect. So when you and I give in to that impatience, it shows our faith is not as strong as it ought to be. When we're in a position, we say, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do, but I got to do something. I'm not sure whether it's right or wrong, but I got to do something. And we're impatient. That proves our faith is weak. Let's learn to believe on the all-powerful, all-knowing, always right God. And learn to have that waiting on Him. So their faith was imperfect. Number two, their faith was idolatrous. Idolatrous. Their faith, again, they felt like they had to have faith in something, but they just... Well, let's look what he says. Verse number 1. Middle part of the verse. They gathered together to Aaron and said unto him, up, make us gods, which shall go before us. Make us gods. God calls that idolatrous desire to worship other gods adultery. Adultery, spiritual adultery. By the way, even though in today's society that's not viewed as a very bad thing, back then that was viewed as a very, very bad thing. People were able to be stoned for that. It was wrong, it was vile, it was wicked. And God says in Jeremiah 3:8, for example, and I saw when for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away. I had given her a bill of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah feared not, but went and played the harlot also. And it came to pass through the lightness of her whoredom that she defiled the land and committed adultery with stones and with stocks. In other words, with idols. He said they've just committed adultery because He claims us as His bride. He claims us as His possession. And then when we go after idols, that's adultery. We may not commit idolatry with stones and with wooden idols, but boy, we sure do with the almighty dollar. We sure do with the possessions. We sure do with everything else, with our pleasures. I began thinking about it. I said, make us gods. They didn't even say make us a God. They said make us gods. Just like many people Because of the lack of faith, they feel many gods are better than the one true God. Are you understand what I'm saying? We think there's certain religions out there that just add another God. That's all they do. They don't mind. When my wife was teaching kindergarten in Texas and had a lot of Indian folks, they didn't mind having their children taught about another God named Jesus until it got to the place where we saw the Bible tells one God. Then they had trouble, because as long as there's many gods, they felt safe. As long as many gods, adding one more. So here they said, make us gods. So many people feel that many gods are better than one God because that dilutes accountability. That dilutes responsibility. Well, which God are you following? I don't know, but my God says this, your God says this. It just, as long as we have many gods, it dilutes that accountability. So they looked for a God. They said, make us gods. They looked for a God they could control. They looked for a God that they could control. By the way, that's what we do these days. We're looking for gods we can control. We're looking for gods that'll do what we want them to do. And that's what he said is there in verse number 1. Up, make us gods which shall go before us. So they're looking for gods that they could control. In fact, they worshiped Jehovah the next morning, but then they turned around and played unto the other God. I think it's there in your notes. Any God will do so long as he does what I want him to. That's how most Christians feel today. They're not able to say, there's one true God and he's got all the power, he's got all the might, he's got all the everything, and I'm just going to follow him. I'm just going to worship him and him only. Even in churches today, we start living a life that we say, well, as long as God does, well, we make God what we want him to be. If we want him to overlook a certain sin, God will overlook that. God won't overlook this, but God will overlook this. In my case, he'll make an exception. So they looked for a God they could control. They looked for a God to which they could contribute. They said, make us a God. So I began thinking about that. And so Aaron said, okay, give me all the gold. And he fashioned it. So as they would worship that golden image, they would say, I made that. That's some of my stuff in there. I contributed to that God. That's a God because I made him God. That's a God because I gave the gold and I gave the silver. In other words, sometimes we're looking to make a God, or for our God to be one we contribute. In other words, that we make him a God. In other words, if we're not careful, we'll get the idea that as long as, in other words, without me giving him my go-ahead, he has no control on my life. In other words, it's the fact that I say he's God, he's God. It's because of what I say he's God makes him all-powerful. It's because the power I give him gives him power over me. No, ladies and gentlemen, he's Almighty God, regardless. And so they looked for a God that they could control. They looked for a God that they could contribute to make it part. So we have to have faith in all-powerful, all-wise, all-caring, all-judging God and learn to have patience. They were impatient. The lack of faith and that impatience, we can't wait. If they would just say, no, I have enough faith that I know God's in control. There is one true God. He's all-powerful, almighty, all good. He's done this for us, and I'm going to have faith in God. So I just have to learn to wait on him. But because they did not have that faith, they had a very weak faith that any God will do, many gods will do, as long, especially one I can control, especially one I can contribute to. He says, well, then that's the way we're going to go. You and I need to get to the place where we have enough faith so that our impatience doesn't drive us to idolatry. Our impatience for God to provide financially will drive us to the idolatry of finances and of gold and other things in this life. Number 2. So the first snare is lack of faith. Impatience from a lack of faith brings idolatry. They just could not wait for God. Number 2. Let's turn to Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. We find impatience from the lure of the flesh begs a life of debauchery. Impatience from the lure of the flesh begs a life of debauchery. Have you ever felt the pressure of impatience because your flesh wants something? You just walk down the mall and you'll figure that out real quick, all right? You say, well, I can't afford it, but I'm going to get it. I can't afford it, but I can't wait for this. I've got to get this because the old flesh just desires it. Or you know you're going to you're going to have dinner after a while, but boy, you want that ice cream now. And so because of that lure of the flesh, We become impatient. In Luke 15, we have the parable, very familiar parable of the prodigal son. He's a perfect example of the lure of the flesh, that impatience brings a life of debauchery. Luke 15, verse number 11. And a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said unto his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divideth unto them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in the land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. A lack of faith here as well. We know that when we read when the brother came and talked about it, the brother says he squandered his money with harlots. Verse 30. But as soon as this thy son was come, which hath devoured thy living with harlots, thou hast killed him the fatted calf. So here we have a young man who, through impatience, he could not wait for the inheritance. He could not wait for the time. He could not wait for the money. He could not wait for his dad to die. He says, no, I need it now. I want it now. We find that lure of the flesh, that desire. I said, I got to have my freedom. I got to go out and experiment with life. I need to go out and be in control of my own self. And that, because that lure of the flesh, that lure to have that, it produced such an impatience, it led to debauchery in his life. Very quickly, notice it begins with desire. It begins with the desire. I'm not sure all the desires in the parable, because it is just a parable, but as he speaks about that, he came to his daddy and said, give me the portion of goods that falleth unto me. Oh, be careful about desires. By the way, we have many good desires and right desires that are only right at certain times of our life. Are you listening to me? There are certain desires that are right, but only at certain times and places in our life. God gave Adam and Eve a certain desire, one for another, but that's only inside the bounds of matrimony. So there's a certain desire that God gave us in our bodies that is right and it's good, but only inside of marriage. You don't do it ahead of time. You don't do it experimenting. You wait until the preacher says you are and you can, and then you do. But until then, you don't. Hello. You keep your... Thank you, sir. We keep ourselves pure. So there are certain desires that are right. Here he says, this is my inheritance. I want it now. But he says, I cannot wait. I will not wait. I must do it now. Why? The lures of the flesh says, man, I got to get out of here. I want to go do what I want to do. And that brought an impatience. How many times have you and I botched up our lives, messed up our lives, because the so flesh wanted something and we could not wait for the right time. We could not wait to deal with it, and it led us to great sin. James 1:14 says, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. So we find it begins with desire. This lure of the flesh that makes us impatient. Well, I just can't wait. I'm not going to wait for it. It began with the desire, but also it seeds disrespect. It seeds disrespect. Now, often we see this in young people, but it's in all ages as well. It seeds disrespect. You can almost hear it in his voice in this parable. And the younger, verse 12, and the younger son said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. Not, can we talk about this? Can we consider this? Can I get a loan? No. It just kind of brings a disrespect. See, when we have the lure of the flesh and we get impatient to satisfy the flesh, when we get impatient to satisfy our own desires, how many understand it often brings a disrespect to authority? It brings disrespect to anything that holds us back. It brings disrespect to anything that puts some kind of control, some kind of restriction on us. That's why for young people many times, that desire, the lust of the flesh, the lure of the flesh, it brings an impatience. They don't want to wait till they grow up. They don't want to wait until they get out of high school. They don't want to wait till they get out of college. They don't want to wait. And so when they try to the lure of the flesh is, I want to be satisfied this. I want to go here. I want to do this. And then when they don't get that impatience brings disrespect. Disrespecting of parents, disrespecting of government, disrespecting of the Bible, disrespecting of pastors, disrespecting of anybody in authority. To any authority that says no or not now, it brings disrespect. So you and I in our lives, if we want to figure out, am I being impatient because of the lure of the flesh? Well, what are your desires? What is bringing you that desire? Is it a desire of the heart or a desire of the flesh? And does it bring some disrespect? In fact, if you look at it, a modern word for what he expressed was entitlement. He had a sense of entitlement. He says, Dad, let's look at it. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. He said, I know it's mine. Give it to me now. I know it's mine. I expect to get it. I expect you to give it to me. This attitude of entitlement. This attitude of it's owed to me. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, let's be careful when we get impatient and we begin to feel entitled. I have a right to do it. I should have the freedom to do that. I should have boy, be careful. He says, you give it to me. Let me help you with something. The only thing that's owed me is hell. That's the only thing that's owed me. I deserve hell. Everything else is just grace of God that I don't get. And so that's what I deserve. So be careful when we feel entitled. Here's a young man. The lure of the flesh. He could hardly wait to get away. And so he could not be paid. It began with a desire. It planted seeds of disrespect to his dad. Very quickly, it led to a departure. It led to a departure. Most runaway young people don't just wake up one day and say, everything was good until lunch. Boy, I'm mad and at lunch, I'm running away. No, it doesn't normally do that. But it builds to that place where it leads to an issue, not just one issue, but a building up to a departure, to a running away. We get impatient. I can't wait. I got to satisfy the flesh. And so this desire begins to build, and I get just disrespectful for anything that's trying to control me, whether it be the church, whether it be God, whether it be the Bible, whether it be my parents, whether it be the government. Boy, I begin to believe. He said, I'm just to his dad, Daddy, I got to get out here. Give me what belongs to me. You owe it to me. And then he very quickly left. Well, I've seen the departure from folks that are impatient because of the lure of the flesh. So they'll leave a home. They'll leave a marriage. They'll leave a church because of impatience. The money was going to come to him. It was just not time. But that old flesh says, boy, I've got to have it. Dad, give it to me now. I'm out of here. You and I have to be careful. That impatience that this old flesh has, because of the lure of the flesh, you'll find yourself fleeing. Leaving the place of safety, leaving to the place where you belong. Very quickly, it brings a decline. It brings a decline. As we see, he began to lose his money. He wasted his money, and then the famine came, and oh, what the mess he ended up down there feeding the swine. It brings a decline. When we're impatient because of the lure of the flesh, it always brings a decline. Be not deceived, Galatians 6:7. For God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. God says, listen, he says, you listen to the flesh, and you get impatient with the flesh, and you go that way, you're not going to reap the good stuff. It's going to reap corruption. It's going to reap the bad. But he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. Let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. In other words, if we're patient. If we're patient. And then finally it concludes in demise. Concludes in demise. It's all over. He was for all intents was dead. That's why his daddy said, my son who was dead, but now he's alive. Man, he was there. It was all over. He was going to eat the food going to the swine. Nobody was there. He was there at the very bottom. I'm just saying, we see it in young people. I see it in adults. Because the lure of the flesh brings a life of debauchery. He was living with the harlots. He was living there with the scum. He would riotous living. Why? Because he was impatient. He said, I can't wait. I want my money now because I've got this burning. I got to go do something. Let's learn to be patient. Very quickly, we see a lack of faith brings patience. Or impatience because of a lack of faith brings idolatry. The lure of the flesh brings impatience. It brings debauchery. Very quickly, impatience from looming fears baits presumption. Impatience from looming fears baits presumption. And that's the story of Saul. Flip over to 1 Samuel chapter 13. You're staying with me. Very good this evening. 1 Samuel chapter 13. Again, another life ruined because of impatience. Because of impatience. The prodigal son life ruined because of impatience. The people that come there where Moses was on the mountain getting the 10 Commandments, their families, their lives were destroyed, many of them, because of impatience. And here we find Saul falls into presumption and life ruined because of impatience. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse number 8. We know the story. And he tarried 7 days according to the time set that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And Samuel said, Bring hither a burnt offering to me, and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Samuel went out, and Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. And Samuel said, What hast thou done? And Saul said, Because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore said I, The Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself therefore, and offered a burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. So we find the story. We've got the enemy Philistines gathering around. The people are fearful, and the people are scared, and they're kind of getting ready to go home and getting ready to abandon. And Saul then goes ahead and forces himself to do what he should not do. Saul, I think it's there in notes, he acted upon the fears of what he saw and the foolishness of what he said. I want you to notice it. How many have ever talked yourself into something wrong? Boy, we talk ourselves into sin. We talk ourselves. We get impatient. And why shouldn't Saul said, I just can't wait. Samuel was supposed to be here, and he's not here yet. He said, so he forced himself. He presumed upon himself to offer the sacrifices that was only to be done by the priest. It was unlawful for him. It was not legal for him. It was not right for him. But because of impatience, he could not wait for Samuel to get there. And because of that, he had presumption, and he got himself into sin. But notice what it says there. Verse number 12. Therefore, when he asked him what he did, and he said, you didn't show up. Therefore, let's back at verse 11, I'm sorry. And Samuel said, what hast thou done? And Saul said, because I saw that the people were scattered from me. Boy, we look at things, and without looking to God, just looking at circumstances, we get afraid. We get afraid. He said, I saw the people were being scattered from me, and that thou camest not in the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. He said, I saw the people going, and I saw the enemy surrounding me. Boy, how many times have we made errors and we become impatient, could not wait on God because of what we saw, because of circumstances, and that fear came upon us. So those looming fears, he said, the people are going to be gone, and the enemy's going to get us. Verse 12, therefore I said, the Philistines will come. I like what he said, therefore said I. To whom? To himself. Therefore I said, oh my, he says, the Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering. Boy, he talked himself right into air. Impatient because of fear. How many times have we been impatient and got ourselves into trouble because we were afraid? The battle had not happened yet. The people were not gone yet, but he was afraid. We're afraid our finances are going to hold out, and so we're impatient, and so we'll do something illegal, immoral, incorrect. We're afraid somebody won't deal with us right, and so we'll deal another way. We fear. We presume. We presume. You say, preacher, what do you mean presume? Number one, it routed him out of his position. It routed him out of his position. He presumed upon himself to offer the sacrifices. His job, he was king. You know, kings had a lot of power. Kings had a lot of authority. Kings had a great position. But that was not his position to offer the sacrifice. That was only for the priest. It was only going to be for Samuel. But he presumed upon himself. In other words, he's saying, I know I'm not supposed to, but But this time the circumstances are different. This time I'm afraid. This time if I don't do it, we're really going to be in a mess. This is a different circumstances. Let's make sure we do not presume upon ourselves to act in places that's not our job. To presume upon ourselves to do something God does not want us to do. To presume upon ourselves to make decisions that God never put in our purview to make the decisions. It routed him out of his position. That fear put him in a position he began acting out of his position that God had not put him in. Boy, I began thinking about that in our lives. How many times, because we were impatient because of fear, we stepped out and did things that was not our job to do. It was just not our place to do. Let me speak to several categories. And I'm not scolding, I'm just saying because I've seen it and I've done it, and so have you seen it and you've done it. Ladies, be careful that because out of fear, you don't step out of place. Husband's still the head. You can encourage him. You can challenge him. You can say, listen, dummy. Listen, husband. But you don't presume to say, but I'm taking control. When you've got a godly husband. Hello. Saul was afraid. So he stepped out of his position of king to step in a position that was not his to take. Be careful, ladies. Again, teach, encourage, guide, but don't say, too bad, I'm taking control. If you've got a godly husband. Careful. Because of fear. Impatient, cannot wait. Men, beware. You have a head also. Hello. See, ladies, you have a head in the family, that's the husband. Husbands, you have a head also, that's Christ. Oh, let's be careful you don't side. I'm afraid, and Christ is not doing it what I thought he ought to do. I just can't wait anymore. I've just got to do something. And so we step out of our purview. We step out of our position and do things we ought not. Teenagers the same way. Church members many times the same way. Let's just be careful that we do not, with impatience because of looming fears, bring us into presumption. Presumptive sin and activities. Very quickly, it routed him out of his position. Number two, it robbed his posterity. It robbed his posterity. He said, all right, because you stepped out of position, because you were impatient. He said, I was coming. I was almost here. He said, but you then, because of your impatience, you stepped out of place. He said, you're not going to be king. Your kingdom will not continue. Who lost out on being the next king? Jonathan. If Saul had not stepped out of place, if Saul had not been impatient, his kingdom would have been forever. God says, no, I was going to make you forever, but I can tell that you're not the man for the job. But because of this sin, he says, your kingdom will not go. I'm going to go over here and give it to David. Jonathan should have been the next king. But Jonathan didn't get to be king because of Saul's impatience. How many times, listen, again, I'm not trying to scare us. I'm just trying to help us realize how many times because of our impatience of a fear, we've made a move and got us out of the will of God, and that hurt our children. That hurt our homes. You may have known some folks that because they were afraid of something and they stepped out of position and took a control that was not part of their life, and they made some move in their life, they got out of the will of God, and their kids lost out. Let's learn to be on guard for impatience. Impatience. The impatience from looming fears baits presumption. Very quickly, impatience from longing to be first begets deception. Impatience from longing to be first begets deception. If you want to turn over to Genesis 25, we may not get it all, but we're just going to briefly talk about it. Very familiar story. In Genesis 25, we have the story of Jacob and Esau. Yeah. God had already said Jacob was going to be number one. God had already said, we got Jacob and Esau. Esau was the older, Jacob was number two in order of birth. The birthright and the blessing always went to the firstborn. That's what it was. But God had said, in this case, it's not going to be that way. In Genesis 25:22, and the children struggled within her, and she said, if it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the people shall be strong, and the one people shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. So God says you got twins in there. He says, but it's not going to come out like we normally think. He says the older one's going to serve the younger. In other words, the younger is going to be the one where the lineage is going to come from. It's the younger one that's going to have the blessings. It's the younger one that's going to do that. So that was the plan. It was already put out. But we know that Jacob could not wait. Jacob says, no, I want to be first. I want to have the blessing. I want to have the birthright. He said he had that burning desire to be first, to be top dog, to take that position. And because if he just had patience, well, how was God going to work it out? I don't know. We'll never find out. We may be able to get to heaven and ask God, what were you going to do about that, God, to make Jacob number one? When Jacob, they couldn't wait. And we know that messed up his life. We know because, well, very quickly, let's get into it. Number one, it stirred his cruelty. Because of Jacob's impatience to be number one, he said, I've got to be number one. I've got to be on top. I've got to be the boss. I've got to have this spot. And that desire into him, number one, it stirred his cruelty. It stirred his cruelty. Genesis 25, verse 29. Helps me get to the right book. And Jacob sawed pottage, and Esau came in from the field, and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, feed me, I pray thee, with the same red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom. And Jacob said, sell me this day thy birthright. And Esau said, behold, I am at the point to die. What profit shall this birthright do to me? And Jacob said, swear to me this day. And he sware unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils. And he did eat and drink, and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. So we find it stirred his cruelty. He said, here's somebody, my brother's coming in, and he's hungry. I'm going to take advantage of him. I'm going to go ahead and swindle him. I'm going to go ahead and cheat. He's not going to die, but I can sure make him think he is. And so it stirred his cruelty. Listen, when you and I are impatient because we want to be top dog, we want to be number one, it will often bring us to the place where we live a life of deception. We begin to deceive. We begin to lie. We begin to trick. We begin to work circumstances around for our own way. How many know what I'm talking about? Because I've got to be on top. I've got to have my way. Here, and when we get to that way, that impatience, it brings cruelty into our lives. We're willing to do what we need to do. I'll say what I'll need to say. I'll not care about the other people. It stirred his cruelty. Number two, it set him up for corruptibility. It set him up for corruptibility. I'm just trying to say, I've seen people get their lives. There's people in jail for this very same reason, because they wanted to be number one. They had that desire, and they were impatient for that, and it just took him to a life of deception and of crime. It stirred his cruelty. It set him up for corruptibility. Chapter 27, verse number 5. And Rebekah heard when Isaac spake to Esau his son, and Esau went to the field to hunt venison for him and to bring it. And Rebekah spake unto Jacob her son, saying, behold, I heard thy father speak unto Esau thy brother, saying, bring me venison and make me savory meat, that I may eat and bless thee before the Lord before my death. So the blessing, so you've got the birthright, which means he was going to get to be the top dog. He was going to be the leader of the family. He was going to be the one that had the spiritual blessing, which he stole from Esau because he was impatient through his cruelty. But now he says his daddy's going to give him the blessing. So when they got the blessing, they usually got a double blessing. In other words, when daddy's dying, he's getting ready to give the inheritance. He says, now, to the one I give the blessing, which is normally the first one, you get twice what everybody else gets. You get to be the top dog. I've got certain blessings for you. And so he said, so Jacob thought he was dying. He wasn't, but he thought he was. And he said, go give me a nice venison. He said, I love the way you cook. Go out and get that. And so now his wife heard that. Verse number 7, he said, I heard him say, bring me venison and make me savory meat, that I may eat and bless thee before the Lord before my death. Now therefore, my son, so this is Mama speaking to Jacob, obey my voice according to that which I command thee. Go out to the flock and fetch me thence 2 good goats, 2 good kids of the goats, and I will make savory meat for thy father, such as he loves. She said, I know the spices he likes. I know what he likes. He said, it won't be dear, but he'll like it just the same. And thou shalt bring it to thy father, that he may eat, that he may bless thee before his death. Because his eyes were going so bad he couldn't see. He was blind and he couldn't see. So he says, we're going to go in and we're going to trick him. And Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, Behold, Esau my brother is a hairy man, and am I a smooth man? My father peradventure will feel me, and I shall seem to him as a deceiver. And I shall bring a curse upon me, and not the blessing. And his mother said unto him, Upon me be thy curse, my son. Only obey my voice, and go fetch me them. And he went and fetched and brought them to his mother. And his mother made them savory meat, such as his father loved. And Rebekah took a goodly garment of his elder son Esau, which was with her in the house, and put it upon Jacob her younger son. We'll find out later, if you read on later, it's because he smelled him and said, Yep, that smells of the field. And she put the skins of the kids of the goats upon his hands and upon his smooth of his neck. And she gave savory meat and the bread which she had prepared under the hand of her son Jacob. And he came unto his father and said, My father. And he said, Here am I. Who art thou, my son? And Jacob said unto his father, I am Esau, thy firstborn. I have done according to thou badest me. And you could read on further. It set him up for corruptibility. She corrupted him. She got him to lie. She's got him to be even more deceptive. Why? Because he wanted to be number one. He wanted that blessing. He got the birthright. Now he wants the blessing also. And because of that great desire and that impatience, he was set in a position for somebody else to use him for more crookedness. Somebody else to use him for more immorality. Somebody else to push him along the way. Ladies and gentlemen, when you and I get impatient for the things that God doesn't want us to have yet, then not only we work on the cruelty of for other people, but also we're set up for a fall into more sin as well. Other people can bring us to the place where we'll be corruptible. Not only that, it seasoned his callousness. It seasoned his callousness. You read the rest of the life of Jacob. He never really shook that deceptiveness. He really never shook that little bit of shade about him. He never really shook that little bit of crookedness about him. Not for years and years to come. When he went and worked with us for his father-in-law, there was some shady business going on in that also. He was always conniving. He was always working. Why? Because he was impatient to be first, and it begat deception. Let me go back and ask the question I asked when we first started. How many of us have ever in our lives, and you don't have to raise your hand because I know it's all of us, have blown it because we were impatient? We've made some wrong decisions because we were impatient. We've messed up our lives, maybe the lives of our family, because we were impatient. We see today lack of faith brought in impatience. They couldn't trust God. They couldn't wait, and took them into idolatry. Allure of the flesh pulling on, made him impatient. He couldn't wait for his dad to die. It was time, I need to have it now. It took him into a life of debauchery and wickedness. We find impatience because of looming fear. Old Saul, he just couldn't wait. He said, I couldn't wait. You weren't here. And I was afraid. So he presumed. He stepped out and made decisions that were wrong. And impatience because he longed to be first made him a deceiver. Let's learn to have patience. Just trust God. Just trust God. And be careful when we feel impatient and like I just have to. Oh my, the snares of impatience. Let's bow our heads, please.
Thanks again for listening to Lighthouse Baptist Church Podcast. Find out more about us at our website, lbceastbay.com. I hope you can visit again real soon.